So it's my great pleasure to introduce Philippa Taylor, who I've known for many, many years, working alongside her on pro-life advocacy issues. And Philippa is now the Associate Director of the Institute for Faith and Culture, which is a Christian leadership program based in the United Kingdom. Prior to that, she was head of public policy for 9 years at Christian Medical Fellowship, and we worked together there. CMF, of course, is one of the member organizations of ICMDA. And her main focus there was research and advocacy on life issues. She has an MA in bioethics and law, and for over 20 years now, she's been speaking, writing, advising, and doing media on a wide range of contemporary bioethics and family issues in the UK. So Philippa, a great pleasure for us to have you here today. We look forward to you speaking to us on the push for abortion in Africa. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so as Peter said, I used to work with him at CMF, but I'm now currently working on a leadership program called the Institute for Faith and Culture. However, I have for nearly 30 years been working on life and family issues, mainly in advocacy and public policy work and campaigning. And I've worked on lots of issues. I've worked on reproductive issues such as IVF, surrogacy, stem cell research, cloning. I've worked on family issues such as cohabitation, marriage, divorce. But the issue that drives me most, that I'm most concerned about, and that really has been the motivation for much of my work, probably for this last 30 years, is abortion. And I want to take you back to when I left university, which was quite a long time ago, and I started working. I had the chance to sit on a parliamentary committee, a parliamentary commission, and it was on the effects of abortion on women. And when I was on that, I was only newly in my job, I heard a doctor give some shocking evidence, and he almost casually told those of us on the panel, the MPs and peers, that he had personally carried out over 100,000 abortions. And he had never seen a woman who had suffered ill effects. Now, he admitted he never followed up after abortion. But then a week or so after that, I recall sitting with a group of women who were really tearfully sharing their stories of the emotional harm that abortion had done to them, that often lasted years, was nearly always hidden. And they were all asking me to share their stories and tell others and to warn others. And I've never forgotten either of those, either the women or the doctor. And I'm telling you that at the outset, simply because much of the rest of my talk will actually be on stats and data. But we need to remember that behind every statistic is a person, a baby who may never live to be born, but also a woman, sometimes just a teenager, suffering in silence, sometimes physically, frequently emotionally. So the data that I'm going to talk about will certainly tell us a story, but I just want to remind us not to forget the people behind the data and the stories. So firstly, my first set of statistics here. In the UK, we have nearly 200,000 abortions per year. It's been legalized since 1967, and despite some legal restrictions which dictate the reasons women can have an abortion, the reality is any woman who wants an abortion in the UK can get one done. They can get it easily, and it's paid for, 97% paid for by our government through the NHS. So it's pretty much on demand here. And now with a big push for medical abortions or DIY abortions, it will only get even easier. The ease of getting an abortion on demand in the UK is the same as in most other Western developed, use developed advisedly, countries, and it has been for years. Now I want to go back in time again, this time to 1994. And there was a major conference on population and development in Cairo. And that brought to the fore for the first time the concepts of sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. And it was at that conference that I first realized that because abortion advocates have in effect kind of won their battles in the West and got abortion on demand and freely available, the next battleground would be developing countries, especially Africa, hence the conference being held in Cairo. I realized that abortion advocates from over here, my country, would focus a lot of attention on campaigning to make abortion just as easily accessible, as widespread and paid for as it is in our developed world. And these advocates want to systematically impose a secular morality on Africa that's completely alien to African culture of life and values and family values. And the push has indeed since then been very powerful. However, thankfully, It has actually taken longer, and the pushback has been more effective than we ourselves managed in our Western nations when abortion was legalized over 50 years ago here. So, but how is abortion being pushed? Well, I'll go into a bit more detail, but basically through direct funding of abortion organizations, through government funded aid with strings attached, through changing laws, through NGOs, through billionaires funding it. And I and others consider this to be a new ideological colonialism of Africa by a cultural elite in the West. Now, this new colonialism is built on aid primarily. Now, obviously, while some aid donors have good intentions and indeed a good impact, others seek deliberately to impose an ideology of sexual liberation, population control, radical feminism, anti-family policies, and abortion rights by tying aid to their ideologies. And these beliefs and practices are not the same as the inherent morals and beliefs of so many Africans. But I'm making some bold statements. So what I want to do now is look at some of the evidence to build up on my case for making those statements. As I live in the UK, my focus is inevitably going to be from here. But actually, the UK does provide a very good example of how Western secular values are being exported to Africa via aid. Many of you will know that the world's two largest abortion providers are two charities called MSI Reproductive Choices and the International Planned Parenthood Federation, MSI and IPPF for short. So I wonder if you realize that MSI Reproductive Choices has actually very recently rebranded from its previous name, Mary Stopes International, and I'll refer to it more as Mary Stopes International because that's where most of the funding up till now has been. But the reason they rebranded was mainly to hide their association with their founder. She was a eugenicist, a racist, and a Nazi sympathizer, as Mary Stopes. And they were named after her and thus were very aligned with her values. But obviously a name change doesn't immediately imply a values change. And as for IPPF, that was founded and initially led by another eugenicist and actually a Ku Klux Klan activist, Margaret Sanger. She began the Negro Project in 1939. I quote her, she said of immigrants, African Americans and poor people, they're human weeds, reckless breeders, spawning human beings who should never have been born. That's the founder of IPPF. And very interestingly, just a few days ago, I saw this headline in the newspaper. And they now realize that they are linked with someone with holding horrendous values, and hold these two organizations and these values in mind as I continue talking through the rest of this talk. Because one of the questions is who funds these organizations? These are the biggest abortion charities in the world. Partly their own abortion business provides some of the funds from actually carrying out abortions and people paying for them. But as charities, they get millions from Western governments. Now, I say millions, and I'll give you some quotes in a minute, but actually it's very difficult to get reliable statistics on funding to organizations such as MSI and IPPF. And it's very difficult to break down the spend that goes to them directly on abortions. And I believe that's deliberate, and I'll come back to that a bit later. But we know it is difficult to get reliable figures. And so the question is why? There's three reasons I'll just look at now. Firstly, abortion funding is hidden behind wording. So for example, here are some terms I put up on the screen. Sexual reproductive health rights, actually includes abortions. In 2016, MSI said they have averted 7.6 million unintended pregnancies, whatever that means. It's neither overt nor clear, but we know it includes abortion provision. Governments also talk about the need to reduce unintended pregnancies in developing countries. And I'll show you, here's an example in a parliamentary answer. So this is a government minister in the UK. In answer to a question said, by helping the world's poorest women access modern contraception, we will prevent an estimated 6 million unintended pregnancies and 3 million abortions on average each year in the UK. And the UK will consider supporting access to safe abortion in the world's poorest countries. That was in 2017. So the link is there. Claims that millions of pregnancies are unintended, then justifies the need for safe abortion care. And reference to safe abortion is basically a euphemism for increasing access to abortion. Or in the words of another government minister, comprehensive sexual reproductive rights is an area where the UK and Canada are continuing to deepen our partnership. This year, we co-hosted a multi-sector safe abortion dialogue in London to drive progress and momentum in this absolutely critical area. So again, clear link between the term reproductive health rights and abortion. And also, obviously, no denial that aid money is being spent directly on abortions. It's also difficult to get exact figures on abortion spend because the government refuses to tell us. There's a lack of transparency. So here's an example of not only Weasley wording, but also refusal by the government to say how much is spent on abortion. And don't worry, we have asked so many times about how much is spent on abortion. So here's the Minister for State for International Development, 2018, said, as this is yet another project that they fund, as the Women's Integrated Sexual Health Programme will deliver integrated sexual and reproductive services, we cannot provide a figure for the number of safe abortions which will be supported. We cannot provide a specific figure for the amount of funding that will be spent on comprehensive safe abortion care. And there's just a list of some of the countries, the 24 countries that they will be spending a lot of millions on. That's on just one project alone. So actual numbers are not known, and a colleague has sent in a Freedom of Information request and just said even asked the government to estimate to the nearest 500,000 how much is spent on abortions, and we got a refusal on the grounds that they do not hold the information. Other excuses are because these services are integrated, it's not possible to disaggregate figures solely relating to safe abortion procedures. And yet we know that some programs, if you dig into some of the programs, we know that they can disaggregate by what is spent on abortions and what isn't, even though ministers state this impossible. So the public is being kept in the dark about what is being spent on abortions in our name with our taxes. And then a third reason it's very hard to get information about figures is that funding is often through other partner agencies. So it's not direct, it's indirect. Sometimes they use management companies as well. Sometimes it doesn't go directly to abortions, it goes to lobby and changing the laws. And I'll come back to that later because that's important. So for an example, we have an organization called IPAS, who basically their strapline is to work globally to expand access to abortion and contraception. And interestingly, their strapline is in that order: abortion first and then contraception. Another quote from them: they improve women's access to quality, safe, comprehensive abortion care in sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of funding goes from here to IPAS, then also to the UNFPA and others that I've listed there. So it is very hard to get information. We have, however, managed to get some. We do know from government answers and from digging around in company reports, colleagues have estimated that UK aid funded in 2019 alone over 1 million abortions overseas, mostly in Africa, funded by taxpayers. I note that was us working out the figures ourselves. So there's one stat. Here's some other stats. These are specific answers that we've had when we've occasionally got a clear answer. 2010 to 2020, DFID. Now I'll refer to DFID a few times. That's the UK's Department for International Development. So that's where all foreign aid comes from, the department. So DFID budgeted 5.7 billion on programmes related to abortion. That included direct and indirect funding. So that will have included going to partners and management companies. That's 5.7 billion. 2012 to 17, MSI alone, one project to MSI, 163 million in UK taxpayer money to be spent on 29 countries in 29 developing countries. 2019, another single project, UK government pledged 42 million to go direct again to a joint project between MSI and IPPF, quoted to increase access to safe abortion. That's just 2019, that's for 42 million. And I'm ashamed to say this, but the UK is the worst in this. No other country gives as much money to MSI than our own Department for International Development. And that's how much more we give than other Western countries. And colleagues have looked at 124 different DFID maternal health programs, 124 from 2010 to 20, and 87 of those had probable abortion provision. 87 is a lot. And that's just some of the countries that it goes to. And I've listed, there's various there, but that includes other African countries as well: Sierra Leone, DRC, Ethiopia, Madagascar. These amounts are not small. Here's another slide. These are just some amounts of the money going to MSI, and that's not even all the other organisations. That's not IPAS, not IPPF. So we're talking millions here, billions, and these are top line figures. But let me give you a bit more detail about how some aid money from the UK has been spent on abortion, and a bit more specific. So I'm going to look at one project, only briefly, called the Prevention of Maternal Death from Unwanted Pregnancy. So 2011 to 2016, DFID gave 67 million to this project. It was run by MSI and close partners. And this is, well, one or two other partners. And it went to 14 countries. This is what it said. It all sounds fairly sensible and fine. There's nothing about abortion in there until you start reading the detail. And 3 of the 4 targets they had were very specific. And these are the targets, 3 of them. Firstly, they've specifically to train over 12,000 healthcare workers in abortions, to provide nearly 5,500 more service delivery sites, that's abortion centres. Thirdly, to support locally led changes to the regulatory and or policy environments for abortion services at national level and across the Africa region. And we reported that they had prevented 1.9 million unintended pregnancies in 2015 alone across 14 countries. We assume that includes many abortions, but because of the terminology, we don't know the exact number. So that is how they break down the spend, and that's how we know that under the headlines, actually, it's very specifically focused on abortion provision. But that third bullet point there is what I just want to spend a bit of time looking at, and that's basically changing laws. So DFID is in the game of supporting local policy changes to make abortion access easier. Now, a couple of years ago, 2019, I saw a fascinating article in the Lancet Journal. Now, this was written, Sarang and Palmer, got just a screenshot of the top there, to pro-abortion researchers. And they were looking at DFID aid to Malawi and Southern Sudan. And they came up with some pretty shocking conclusions and quotes in there. And they basically highlighted how Western governments work through charities such as MSI to put political pressure on African governments to overturn laws that protect unborn babies. But by doing so, they deliberately hide their influence. Now, obviously, legalizing abortion for MSI is great for MSI because they get more business and more money as a result. But let's look at, I want to just give you I've pulled out some quotes from this report, which I found shocking when I first read it. So this is talking about the reporting of these researchers on DFID funding providing aid for Malawi and Southern Sudan. Let me give you some quotes here. The DFID programme exemplifies a trend in which NGOs conduct political advocacy, often on donors' behalf, but their power is hidden from view. So the DFID programmes are hidden. DFID use strategies of concealment, and they hide it within the field of reproductive health. So they're deliberately concealing what they're spending. In Malawi, IPAS became an important participant in a process to reform the country's restrictive abortion law. So IPAS, funded by DFID, is actually being used to change the law in Malawi. Using DFID funding, the IPAS country office even helped draft a termination of pregnancy bill. In Malawi, they sought to shift the debate on abortion away from morality, religion, and even rights, which is the best way of meeting the pro-life opposition. In other words, they realized there would be opposition from pro-lifers. So what do? Get the debate using local charities and local funders and local organizations to take the debate away from anything to do with any morality or religion, because they know how powerful that is in pro-life countries. Some more quotes. Although external support and funding clearly played a central part in enabling national policy processes, we observe that such influence and the power it reflects is hidden from view through various practices of concealment that downplay foreign agency and attribute it to national or local ownership. So they're basically saying there is external funding, but that's hidden from view, and they conceal it they conceal that foreign agency, and they effectively imply that it's national or local influence and power. At the top, DFID was discreet about its financial support to its NGO subcontractors' political advocacy. So in other words, DFID doesn't want to say that they're using subcontractors to advocate for abortion changes in law, legal changes. Although DFID says that it wants to be as transparent as possible, it made only a selection of programme documentation publicly available, that's to the researchers, and it encouraged little or no public communication about the programme aims, citing security risks. Donors like DFID take advantage of the opaqueness of development structures to achieve discretion around reproductive health programming, and particularly policy work. I didn't quote it, but actually these same researchers mentioned that they'd actually tried to impact the findings of this research, the researchers in the article, and change their wording. So this is quite shocking, I think. But the question is, why is the government trying to work behind the scenes to influence abortion laws in developing countries? Well, at one level, obviously, as I've said right at the beginning, they're trying to impose a certain ideology. They believe that abortions should be legalized in these countries and far more and available in the same way they are in the West. Why are they trying to do it behind the scenes? Firstly, I mean, I'm sure it won't be any surprise to you. Foreign donors know that foreign funding will be perceived by the recipient countries, those in Africa, as neo-colonialist and hypocritical, and they're fully aware of political sensitivities in imposing on them a Western agenda and laws, and they admit it. Here they go, it's the same report. Or I know there were two reports, very similar, I can't remember which one this was from, but DFID, working through international NGOs with strong national level alliances, helps avoid accusations of inappropriate or even neo-colonial donor interference. It's in the report. They know that if they're seen to be doing it, it will be seen as neo-colonial. And they go on to say the advocacy cannot be seen as coming from outside. Secondly, foreign donors know that if local people were aware of the pressures from the West to impose more abortion on them, they would be strongly opposed, both to liberalising abortions and to the opening of more abortion clinics. You know, Sudan and Malawi, along with a lot of African countries, are much more pro-life than the West. They value the unborn child, and the authors admit this. Abortion is widely considered sinful and heavily stigmatised in both places, that's in both those two countries. They know they have to do it. They know that those countries would resist liberal abortion being imposed on them by a West that knows best, if they knew that that West was doing that. And the sad thing is, though, there has been a lot of changes to laws through Africa, and as a consequence of their campaigning since the turn of the millennium, about 21 out of 48 countries have reduced restrictions on access to abortion. So it has become much more liberalised in a number of countries. And as an aside, I can't go into the detail on this, but legalising abortion does have a major impact on numbers. One example is Chile. After abortion there became illegal in 1989, the deaths related to abortion decreased. That's including maternal deaths, obviously, as well as the numbers of abortion. So a tighter law there reduced the deaths. And similarly, we've seen in different states and in Mexico, and I've done some work on that. I just would add here, actually, there has also been a real pressure to push medical home abortions on women. The WHO has been particularly pushing this, and they say that many women, especially in rural areas, can't access healthcare providers being abortion providers. So the WHO contends that it's preferable for them to resort to self-administered abortion at home. And we've done lots of research in the UK, and we know that there are so many complications from drug-induced abortions. They're serious and they're extensive in the West. Something like, in one Finnish study, 20% of women had serious complications after doing home DIY medical abortions, 15% severe hemorrhage. Many need medical intervention after it. So imagine the harrowing consequences in the developing world where you've got poor roads and access to hospitals and not such good medical facilities for basic life-saving interventions. How can women who already suffer from a lack of medical support be expected to survive the complications from home abortions? It defies belief, really, that they're pushing that, but that is the next big push for this in developing countries. Now, just so you know that it's not pro-life organisations that are concerned about DFID funding. A couple of years ago, an independent watchdog in the UK reviewed DFID funding. That's our aid funding. And they were very critical of DFID. Basically, and they had loads of criticisms, but a big one was that they said that DFID was putting too much focus on family planning and abortion. And they said that there was insufficient funding given by our government to reduce the most common causes of maternal deaths, not unsafe abortion, but infection and hemorrhage. And the truth is, and this is really important, as I'm of course really concerned about women's health, but the truth is lower maternal mortality is best explained by women's literacy and education, maternal health care, obstetric care, sanitation, clean water. That's where the funding should be. This is more criticism of DFID aid from their independent watchdog report. But pro-life campaigner, Uju Ekiocha, she says, "My lifeline out of poverty was education." And this is why she's been a strong advocate for this issue as well, and the concerns about this being neocolonialism, a new form of neocolonialism. And this neocolonialism, as I said at the outset, is one of ideology, and it has new masters who call themselves donors. And it's not about military occupation this time, it's an invasion of culture and of the moral worldview of local peoples. And it's often, as I've said, behind the scenes. And as I've tried to show, foreign aid all too often ties women's health policy to advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights, which includes abortion. But the problem is when the UN, the WHO and others, rich donor countries like the UK push for abortion as a universal human right, it puts a lot of pressure on pro-life countries, because no country or person wants to be accused of violating human rights with the shaming and the loss of foreign aid that follows. But these high pressure tactics disrespect the core values of many nations, and they infringe on their national sovereignty, as I've shown with the campaigning behind the scenes. And it does reek of "we know better than you," as the UK developed world imposes its own Western-centered, ideological, liberal, secular values that are completely alien to the culture of life and family values in Africa. And it seems that evidence is not allowed to stand in the way of ideology. And one little example of this, the way President Biden in his election promised to fund abortions in developing countries. He revealed starkly the attitude of many in the West. This is what he said on the campaign trail. He said, "People are dying around the world. We are their saviors, providing for the healthcare of women in ways that nobody else has been able to. We are their saviors." And yet the truth is, Africans, as a major generalization, of course, tend to value larger families. They hold to more religious and traditional views of sex and relationships, and they see children as a blessing, not a cost, as we do. And actually, interesting, they're also wary of the costs and side effects of contraception. I mentioned that ICA report again about DFID aid, and they reported that women expressed concerns about the side effects and health risks with modern contraceptive methods. And there's opposition to it. It's not that they can't access contraception, it's more that they don't want to use it. The answer by family planning organisations who have a vested interest in imposing on them is to educate women. We need educational programmes designed to address opposition to family planning. It's not just me. I hope that I'm right in saying that, well, I know I'm right in saying what the views are in African countries towards abortion, because actually here's one poll that was done fairly recently in Kenya. 85% of people are firmly opposed to abortion, and local campaigners in other African countries have also revealed the majority of citizens are opposed to abortions within their own countries. And still about 80% of African countries have laws that some sort of law that prohibit or restrict abortion. And what I'd love to see is the tables turned the other way. You know, what makes us think in the West, with our culturally biased views, we have such high abortion rates, as I said at the outset, 200,000 a year on demand in the UK. We have high family breakdown rates. We have shriveling community values. How do we know what's best for Africa? I believe it should be the other way around. And Uju, as I quoted her earlier from Target Africa, there's one of the quotes she says, and I think this is so true: "The most precious gift that Africans can give to the world right now is our inherent culture of life." And Uju is not the only one. One of the things she did is she gathered together other Africans to send a message back to President Biden. I don't know if it's got to him, and I doubt it will, and I suspect it wouldn't change his view anyway. But on my last screen that I'm going to bring up now, I'll just leave you with a few quotes that she gathered, Uju, in a video a message to Biden that I just wish our Western government leaders and those who are dictating our aid to Africa could read right now. And here are some of them. And I'm just going to leave those up on the screen for you to read, and then I'll come out of the screen share and take questions.
Thank you very much, Philippa, for goodness, an incredibly comprehensive and alarming presentation about the push for abortion in Africa from a UK perspective. And we've now got a time of Q&A. So Philippa, lots of questions starting to come now, and Brighton Chitenga is asking, are African institutions like the AU, that's the African Union, or the SADC, which is the South African Development Community, or the ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, so collaborations of national governments, are they aware of this agenda, do you think? And if so, what are they doing about it? Or are they similarly in the dark? So the things that you've been sharing with us.
Okay, on that, I don't know about those organisations and how much they know. I suspect, as of what I was showing about how much is concealed, I suspect they probably don't know the extent of the pressure. The only thing that I could say that might, I'm just looking at something on my notes. The only thing that might shed a little bit of light on that, because I can't answer that directly, but when I was looking at some of the work that the Guttmacher Institute have done, one of the things that they have said that has been very effective in changing abortion laws in Africa particularly has been what's called the, I'm just looking up on my screen, the Maputo Protocol in 2003. And that had some very prescriptive language on abortion criteria. And I think most African countries signed up to that. And there was an article in there, Article 14, which basically said that countries should authorize medical abortions and reduce unsafe abortion. So again, the terminology unsafe abortion, everyone agrees, thinks that sounds fine, but actually basically means access to abortion. So countries that have signed up to the Maputo Protocol are basically using that to campaign, well, abortion advocates within the countries are using that to campaign. That's the only one that I'm aware of, that's an African Union one. That would be the only one that I'm aware of where they'll be aware that actually there is a lot of campaigning going on to change the laws. As for those other specific organisations, I don't know. Obviously in South Africa, abortion is legalised and it has been for quite a few years. So the South African situation is a bit different to most other African countries. It's much more liberal there.
Thanks. Interesting to look at some of the comments in chat. Jenny Ellis from the UK is saying, I did not realise this. I'm utterly horrified about what our aid is doing. And I think what you shed light on today, many people will not be aware of. Scott Mwanza is saying this is a powerful presentation. Are you going to send us the recording of this presentation? Well, yes, we have been recording it today and it will be up on our YouTube channel in the next 24 hours or so. Sherry Falkenheimer from CMDA US, Philippa, who's very much involved in international education. In fact, she spoke on webinars just last week. And she makes the comment, terminology is important. The first thing those trying to change ethics tend to do is to change the language. For example, a collection of cells in place of an embryo. Speaking of the push for abortion in other countries as neo-colonialism, she says, is a great way to push back using different terms. Any other ideas of terms that might be effective in stimulating responses to abortion pressures from outside the country in other nations?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with terminology. It's incredibly powerful as a tool for changing and softening people and hiding. And that's what I tried to show, some of those examples. And the whole Cairo conference was all about women's development, women's rights, but hidden in it is always, there's been a massive battle over language and wording, a huge battle, always trying to get abortion in as in right, so they'll have top line things like women's reproductive health rights or whatever, and in the small print they'll want to get in there the word abortion so that they can then directly link it. And so the battles have been over what happens in the small print and what is included in those top line words, and I think a lot of the time we've lost the battle on that, I'd say, because people aren't aware really. The most people will not be aware that reproductive health rights includes so much more. And family planning, I mean, that's a classic term that is used. Sometimes it is purely contraception. A lot of the time it includes abortion. And what is very difficult in all of this is to actually disaggregate the two. So if we can disaggregate, and for us in our campaigning and work, it is important to disaggregate, because if we get tied up with contraception and family planning issues, then that's a whole different issue. And it can actually not, we will lose some of the people we would work with who would be maybe supportive of family planning through contraception, but they would be very against using abortion. So I think it's really important that we disaggregate the two as much as we possibly can. We're trying to disaggregate, they're trying to put them together. So they're trying to include things like abortion under issues that are acceptable to most people. So that's one of the challenges, is always trying to just get to the root of what is included and what is not. I mean, terminology over here is it's the same in the UK in the terms of abortion and you know, the use of the fetus, and they don't ever term the embryo, it's a cluster of cells. It's always about women's rights, not responsibilities. I mean, I can't tell you off the top of my head lots of other terminology, but I think all I would say is that terminology is the most incredibly powerful tool. But it's one that can be used both ways. And I think it's one that we must be very careful that we use correct terminology and things, and we don't get sucked into using their terminology. You know, you've worked on end of life issues, you know, so we've got to be, it's the same there, that we've got to be very careful that we don't use their terminology, dignity and dying. Actually, no, it's not, or euthanasia, it's not death with dignity. We've got to be really careful in everything that we don't get sucked into terminology and using their terminology, and we're very accurate about what we're talking about.
Now, a lot of this money, as you've said, you've given a great example of the UK, and we know this is true in other European countries and the US, particularly under the current new administration with this ideology. But Andrea Lowen saying, how can we best respond or advocate against neocolonial promotion of abortion by our governments in the West? What should we be doing as Christian doctors?
Yeah, that's such a good question. You know, that's what we're challenged by. How do we do this? The first thing, and I was thinking this because I thought this might be, I mean, it's the obvious question really to answer. And I was thinking, okay, I always think of this. So now what do we do about this? I'd be exactly the same. So what a group of colleagues have been doing is, well, what we've been doing for years. The first thing is to try and get facts out. That's the first port of call. And that's what we've been trying. I mean, as I've said in the talk, it's really hard to do that because the government is just not letting the stats out. But eventually it will come out. And for us, that's meant a lot of hard work digging. It's not just asking questions, it's going and reading a lot of reports. It's going right down into the detail. So I gave you an example of something that top line looked okay, but actually when you spend quite a lot of time looking at the reports and the detail and the funding, you find out so much more information. And then once you get that information, you can then take it back to politicians and they can ask much more specific questions of the government. Yes. So a lot of it, I would say the first thing is find out the facts and the information. Mm-hmm. The second point after that is the classic, then going to our MPs, our politicians, and getting the ones who are on side to ask questions, to have meetings with top politicians and challenge how aid is being funded. And it's one of the things where we can work, where we can always get support, and it's a safe way to argue, is people agree that we need transparency. So you don't even need to say what it's for, but there is a strong argument to say that governments need to be transparent in how they're spending money. You know, they need to be accountable. Those two words are safe, acceptable words, but actually they are very valid in this. So if we can get transparency and accountability from governments, and then you start, the kind of things we would do is send the information to a newspaper, you know, and get newspapers, friendly journalists, to actually put that out to the public, because that's the best way of getting out to the public. We can send it to our circles of friends, which is great, but actually journalists and the media are the best places to get it. And then at the same time, I think what we've also tried to do, and Udru's very good at this, and others, is try and tell people who are receiving aid, countries, what's going on, because actually they don't know. So we can work on our governments, but we mustn't forget that actually it's also very effective to find colleagues in other African countries where they're recipients of the aid, and just tell them, do you know that aid or that there's campaigning to change the laws going on once we find out the information. It's hard work. It is really hard work, and it requires a lot of work on the ground, but it's the information is there. It's just getting it. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's really, it's reminiscent, isn't it, of the Lord saying what's done in secret will be shouted from the rooftops. And it's incredibly important, I think, to expose these practices. The reason they're done in secret is that people do know that what they're doing is wrong, I think, deep in their heart of hearts, and to just open the light on it and make it obvious through the kind of questioning that you're talking about.
That reminds me, the challenges we're up against. So I talked quite a lot about that Lancet report, and actually that was written by two researchers who are pro-abortion. We went to them, or a colleague went to them, because we wanted to expose that, and we had a journalist who was really interested in that. They refused to give any more information. They didn't want to have anything to do with us because they knew we were pro-life, and they were sort of backed off saying, oh, things will have changed, we're not going to have anything to do with us. So it's actually, you're right, it is very, very hard to get things out, but that gave us enough information in there, but things get hidden, really hidden.
Yeah. So, question from Robert Colhoun here, who you'll know. Can you comment, he says, on the legality of abortion provision in African countries? In other words, are DFID and other national governments or big funders paying for illegal abortions in Africa through MSI Choices and other abortion providers? And what sort of evidence do we have about that they're actually breaking the law in these places where abortion is really frowned upon?
We're working, it's a very good question. I'd love to know the answer. We're working with very clever people. They're not stupid. Whenever you ask questions and whenever there's any probing questions, they always say, we're not doing anything, we're only providing information, we're not doing anything that is illegal. So they're saying that they push for more abortion provision only in countries where it's legal, or legal for certain reasons. So we have pushed on, and there seemed to be a big expose at one point in Kenya on this, finding that actually DFID money going to Mary Stopes was then being used to fund and pay for abortions. But actually it proved very hard to find the direct link. So there were some newspaper articles and it seemed to be that there was a direct link, but actually to get the hard evidence is very difficult because they're very clever, they know. So one can only suspect. I think it would be very hard to actually find real cases of where it's truly illegal and where we have very hard evidence of it, and part of the problem is because it's done through other agencies and organizations, and even MSI, I'm sure there's lots of illegal abortions going on there, but to actually find that and to find a direct link with UK funding to illegal abortions is very difficult because there's so many middlemen in it all and middle organizations and things. So it's very hard. And the government, to be fair to the government, they would be very stupid if they were ever caught funding illegal abortions, or campaigning overtly to change laws. And I don't believe actually that would be their intention. I do think, to give them some credit, I think that they might want to push it on African countries, but they won't want to do anything illegal. They certainly wouldn't ever want to be caught. So I would suspect that there's probably a grey area there, but I would be very surprised if they went directly into funding illegal abortions. But I don't think that necessarily negates the case that we have, even if it's not illegal. It's ideological, it's neocolonialism, which is why that argument for neocolonialism actually carries a lot of weight, because it doesn't need to be illegal for people to be concerned about the fact that we're imposing an ideology on African countries.
Margaret Eames-Peterson is asking, many of the African countries that we're talking about have Muslim governments, and Muslims are also opposed to abortion. So how does DFID hide their intentions from these and other governments? Is it exclusively by working through NGOs and using confusing language, or are the governments aware and just not doing anything about it?
I think I don't know exactly. I mean, it's interesting, isn't that research was Southern Sudan, not Northern Sudan. So I would doubt that that DFID will do much to concern Muslim countries at all, or governments. I think they'll be very wary of that, and I suspect they've probably got other aid projects there as well. So I don't know for sure, but I do think, yeah. I don't know exactly the answer to that, because I don't know if they treat Muslim countries and governments differently to others. But I do think that whether things are illegal or not, we just don't know. We just don't know. I think. What was the second part of the question? Remind me.
Just how do they? Are the national governments in whose countries this is happening are simply not aware of what's going on because it's all being done secretly, or are they aware but just not doing anything about it for some reason? I mean, you talked about the link, maybe to unpack a little bit about the link to aid, which you mentioned. Is aid sometimes, aid to African countries, conditional upon accepting funding for these sorts of purposes?
Yeah, I mean, aid is very focused. So a lot of this aid will be specifically for safe abortions. So some of it will be very focused, and therefore they wouldn't be able to use it for anything but abortions. Some of it will go to family planning, and then it can be chosen. That question, I know what I was going to say, actually, that question reminded me of something that I had read. In answer to how it works with governments, it's a bit like our government. A lot of it will depend on who's in power and what politicians are there. So the effectiveness will depend very much on whether you can get pro-life politicians opposing it. And it was interesting, if for people who are interested in how we might campaign to not get laws legalized in African countries, it is well worth having a look at the Guttmacher website and look at what they say about abortion laws in African countries, because it's striking there. They talk quite a lot about how they work to liberalize abortion laws, and they say what is effective in working to liberalize abortion. So of course, it then shows us, well, what has been effective in stopping that? And one of the things that's been very interesting is I do recall reading that I think a pro-abortion law got all the way through to the president of the country. It was a Southern African country, I can't remember which one, and he refused to sign it. So actually, it was the president who stopped the law from getting right to being implemented. So that actually just shows you it actually will depend often on a person. So if you can get a pro-life politician in place in a key position and aware of what is happening, they will get enough support in these countries, if they can highlight what's going on, to be able to stop a bill going through, which is why those who are trying to legalize abortion have to do things behind the scenes. They have to do things hidden away, because they know that once it gets exposed, most of the population will not be supportive. So a lot of it will depend on individuals, I would say, but it is definitely worth looking at the Guttmacher site and see how they like to liberalize the laws and what works. And I hinted at that in one of the slides, saying, don't talk about religious things, don't talk about religious beliefs or moral rights or whatever. Avoid that kind of language, because they know that's powerful language. Or even rights. You can't even talk about rights.
Yeah, a number of people have expressed interest in the DFID report, and if that's in the public domain and you can give us that, then we'll put that in the letter that we write to people afterwards, so that others
The Lancet one is the most interesting one, and it's quite difficult to get, but it's certainly in the public domain. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll add that to the report afterwards.
Yeah.
I wonder, can you say a bit about what's motivating this neocolonialism? Is it just that Western governments are all driven by secular humanist values and want to promote free sex and dealing with its consequences? And is it a kind of radical feminism thing, or is there a darker side to this as well? You mentioned about the links between the founders of MSI and IPPF, Margaret Sanger and Mary Stopes, with the white eugenicist movements. And you also mentioned population control as well. Is there a darker side here where Western governments and companies are just wanting to curb population growth? Is there some fear of, of the developing world getting stronger? Any comments on that?
I don't need to say much. I think you've said it all there, which is great. I completely agree. The only, for sure, I 100% endorse all of those reasons. I don't think you need to put that into a question. I'd say that as a statement. The only thing I would say, I would put two ends to that. I completely agree with everything, and I think that's absolutely right. I would say at one end, there is a genuine, I would say amongst a lot of my friends, they genuinely want and believe that this is going to help women, that this is healthcare for women, and that women need to have a choice, and they don't like abortion, and they don't think it should be maybe as available on demand, but they just sort of feel it's good that women have a choice, and they're worried about women having lots of children when they don't want them, and they think that contraception isn't easily available. And I think there is a genuine altruism from some people who haven't heard what I've said, and what's going on and what's driving it. And I think I think there's some in government who genuinely think they're doing the right thing, and that there's nothing much more to that than just not really understanding what's going on. So I think we've got to give a bit of leeway to some people that they genuinely think it helps, and that this is about healthcare and it is helping women. And then there is that group who are ideological, saying, we've succeeded in the West and religion is evil and all of this, and let's get secular morality over there, as you said. And then there is also the population control issue, which has been historical and I think is ongoing. And I would say, so that's going through. I would say finally, the only thing that you haven't said, which you and I have talked about a lot in the past, is this clearly a spiritual battle, isn't it? And I would say it is. We'll come back to the thing that I said right at the very beginning about why abortion has been such a big issue for me over the last 30 years, is because I believe it's one of the biggest spiritual battles we're facing. That's my personal belief. I think it's a massive battle. I think this is a huge, huge spiritual battle. We're talking about millions of babies being killed through abortion every year. I think it's a spiritual stronghold. I think this is a very dark battle. And so I would say that, yeah, I think we're seeing a big battle. And I think that battle is taking place. It's obviously still taking place in the West, but it's really taking place over Africa, I think. Yeah. So I wouldn't want to downplay the significance of it at all. But that's, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that's why, given that it's a spiritual battle, I guess that's why we would not be surprised to see that lies and deception and secretive, methods are really underlying what's happening as well. The comment you made earlier about the real priorities in Africa, and we all know that in sub-Saharan African countries, some of the stats for maternal mortality and infant mortality are among the worst in the world. And we know that interventions like the education of women, for example, you talked about, trained birth attendants, good antenatal care, good nutrition, these sorts of things. We know they're absolutely transformative life changes, cultural transformers in this kind of situation. Why, from what you've said, it seems that a lot of the Western money is going directly into abortion or contraception, population control, rather than addressing these real needs, which people are most concerned about in Africa.
Yeah, the ICA reports, that's the independent commission, the watchdog that looked at DFID spending.
The ICAI, yeah.
Yeah, the ICAI. They were very critical of DFID, particularly for the overemphasis on, they called it, on family planning and abortion. And they were the ones that said more should go to other health issues for women, particularly things like infection and maternal health care and things like that, all the things you've just cited. So they highlighted it. That's not to say, and so I think it's a genuine problem that too much is going to safe abortions, and indeed contraception, and pushing that on women who are basically saying we can get it as easily as we want, but we just don't want it. And so therefore they need to be educated, as I said. However, that's not to say that no aid is given to other things. So I mean, we've got to be careful that not all aid is going to abortion. There is a lot of different money going to good causes, to maternal health care, and sanitation and water. So this is just one aspect of aid, and it is difficult. I suppose it is worth, there's a battle going on in the UK, as you probably know, about the UK reducing our aid and the amount of aid that we give to developing countries, and a lot of Christians genuinely saying we must be seen to give lots more aid. We shouldn't be cutting our aid to developing countries, and I do understand that. I think that's really important that we do give aid. All I would say, and so I'm not against giving aid, and I'm not sure about whether we should cut it or not. My biggest concern is how that aid is spent. So I think what I'm wanting to hold our government to account on is not the issue of aid itself. That's a whole different area, which I won't go into now, but actually how, on what the aid is spent. And this is where it comes back to that point. We've just got to try and disaggregate where the aid is going, and good aid that is going to help women's maternal mortality. Let's just push that and emphasize that and say that's where the government should be spending more money. Let's get away from this emphasis and all these projects through MSI and IPPF. Let's get them out of the picture. To be honest, the amount that is going to MSI and IPPF is shocking. So our focus should be on trying to get it away from that. It's not working at the moment. They seem to be spending even more on it. But that's where I'd love to see, let's take the money away from those charities and put it where it's needed.
And I guess this is where the term colonialism is so appropriate in this context, because in a sense what you're telling us is that money is being given with strings attached, so that people in the West are deciding what the priorities are in Africa, and that it's all about abortion and contraception and not about reducing maternal mortality and child mortality. And that is, and of course, then if aid is made conditional on African governments implementing these programs, then that's one of the worst forms of colonialism imaginable, isn't it? It's a really evil thing that we must oppose.
And one of the things that I said that I quoted again, that a DFID or ICAI report said that if women don't want contraception on them, they need to be educated to accept it, basically. And I find so that's a terrible imposition of our values, just because they have decided, you know, that people generally are saying, well, actually we're wary of the health risks of contraception, and actually we want to have more kids and we can get contraceptives anyway. So here's our government saying, well, let's educate them so they accept it. It's that kind of thing that I think is shocking.
Well, it's an extraordinary level of arrogance too, isn't it?
Yeah,
so,
it is.
Philippa, I'm afraid we've just about run out of time. Well, we probably have, but I just wanted to ask you one question as we go and finish. And you gave this very moving account early on of the two meetings you went to with the man who'd performed over 100,000 abortions and never seen a woman hurt by it. And then a week later, the group of women who'd been deeply traumatized by abortion. And of course, we've got to remember it's the women are being traumatized as well as the babies. But I just wanted to ask you, as a Christian, having been involved in the cutting edge on these issues for so many years, and it's really tough, these issues, what is it that really keeps you going, doing what you're doing, and how can we best pray for you?
The women. You and I have had lots of discussions, isn't it? I think people have different motivations on this. Because I started this area hearing from the effects of abortion on women, although I have a deep concern for the babies that are killed through it. I have a deep, and obviously I don't want to downplay that. But I suppose because I came into it hearing from women, and you mentioned I did an MA, and I sat with a lot of women and listened for an hour or more to their stories. I suppose that's the main motivation I've had, to actually get their stories out. And because I realized that there's two victims here, in this. And so it's the women and their stories, I think, have been the main motivation for me, plus the spiritual side, just feeling that this is the biggest spiritual battle. The third thing, I nearly put it into my talk, but I didn't because I hadn't have enough time. But now you've mentioned it, we often talk about the two victims of abortion, the baby and the mother. But I remember once suddenly realizing, and that story highlighted it again to me, that actually there's the third victim, and that's the abortion doctor or the medical professionals who are carrying out abortions and who are seeing the babies that they're destroying and killing. And I cannot ever see how someone who's carried out 100,000 abortions or one abortion will not be profoundly affected in some way, whether that's just through their conscience being dulled or something. And I think that's the third victim, actually. So I've often felt we don't think about that third victim, but those people who are carrying out the abortions, I think, are victims as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philippa. So it's been a huge challenge to us all, I think, to hear this as Christian doctors and dentists, and to realize that we are in a position where we can be a voice for the voiceless or a voice to power, but we need to be educated to know what's happening. Thank you so much again, Philippa, and also to all of you for joining us here on ICMDA webinars. May God bless you. Thank you.